March 6, 1944, 28,000 feet above Berlin, Germany. The contrails form geometric patterns against the pale winter sky, white lines scratching across blue canvas at altitudes where the air grows thin and cold enough to freeze blood in exposed veins. A formation of American B-17 Flying Fortresses drones eastward toward the German capital, their four-engine roar audible for miles, their silver fuselages catching sunlight like migrating birds of prey. Below them, air raid sirens wail through Berlin streets. Citizens rush toward shelters they have come to know too well. Luftwaffe pilots scramble toward their fighters, pulling on leather helmets, checking oxygen connections, preparing for the interception that has become routine. American bombers penetrate German airspace, German fighters rise to meet them, and somewhere over the Reich, men die in burning aircraft while below them, cities burn from the bombs that get through. But today, something is different. The Luftwaffe pilots climbing toward combat altitude notice it first as anomalies in the expected pattern. Escorting the bombers are fighters, single-engine aircraft with distinctive profiles, their noses elongated by liquid-cooled inline engines, their wings clean and uncluttered. These are not the stubby Thunderbolts that usually turn back at the German border when their fuel runs low. These are sleeker, faster, and impossibly, they are here, over Berlin, 600 miles from their bases in England. The German pilots check their fuel gauges instinctively, calculating the mathematics of their own endurance. They have perhaps 40 minutes of combat time before they must return to base or fall from the sky with empty tanks. These American fighters, by all logic and known aviation technology, should have turned back 200 miles ago. They have not turned back. They circle the bomber formations like sharks, silver predators with red noses and checkerboard markings, and when the German fighters commit to their attacks, these American escorts peel away from the bombers and dive to engage with an aggression that suggests unlimited fuel reserves and absolute confidence. The dogfights that follow scatter across 50 miles of German sky, and the Luftwaffe pilots discover that these new escorts can match or exceed their own aircraft in speed, outturn them in sustained combat, and most terrifyingly, pursue them all the way back to their own airfields if they try to break away. The Germans are fighting over their own homeland, close to their bases, with the fuel security that comes from operating on interior lines. Yet somehow, impossibly, they are at a disadvantage. The aircraft destroying German air superiority over Berlin this March morning is the North American P-51 Mustang, and the German pilots engaging it cannot comprehend the combination of design innovations and strategic decisions that have brought these fighters so deep into the Reich. The Mustang represents more than just another fighter aircraft. It embodies a revolution in aeronautical engineering, strategic thinking, and industrial execution that will permanently alter the balance of air power in Europe and render obsolete the Luftwaffe's entire defensive doctrine. The story of how American fighters came to escort bombers all the way to Berlin begins not with triumph, but with crisis, not with clever planning, but with the recognition of strategic failure. When the United States Army Air Forces began its daylight strategic bombing campaign against Germany in 1942, the doctrine governing that campaign rested on assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. American military theorists believed that large formations of heavy bombers, each bristling with machine guns and flying in mutually supporting combat boxes, could fight their way through enemy airspace without fighter escort. The bombers would defend themselves through concentrated defensive fire, and their high altitude, heavy armor, and tight formations would render them nearly invulnerable to interception. These assumptions died over Germany in the fall of 1943. Luftwaffe fighters, initially caught off guard by the heavily armed American formations, adapted their tactics with brutal effectiveness. They attacked from head-on where the bombers' defensive armament was weakest. They used cannon-armed heavy fighters and even rocket-equipped aircraft to stand off beyond machine gun range and attack with explosives. Most importantly, they concentrated their forces at points where American escort fighters had to turn back due to fuel limitations, creating killing zones where bombers flew unprotected for hundreds of miles. The results devastated the American bombing campaign. During the Second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers out of 291 dispatched, a loss rate of over 20%, with another 17 aircraft so badly damaged they would never fly again. The crews began calling certain targets maximum effort missions with grim humor that barely concealed their terror. Statistical analysis suggested that bomber crews had less than a 50% chance of surviving their required tour of 25 missions. The daylight bombing campaign, centerpiece of American strategic planning in Europe, teetered on the edge of operational collapse. The solution required an escort fighter with range unprecedented in aviation history, an aircraft that could accompany bombers from England to targets deep in Germany and return, a round-trip distance exceeding 1,200 miles, while maintaining the speed, altitude capability, and combat performance necessary to defeat Germany's best fighters. No aircraft in service or development with any Air Force in 1943 could meet these requirements. The laws of physics seem to forbid it. Fuel weighs 6 pounds per gallon. Carrying enough fuel for extended range required either massive fuel tanks that degraded performance or multiple external tanks that created drag and reduced speed. Fighter aircraft operated under the tyranny of the fuel-weight performance triangle. You could have long range, or you could have high performance, but you could not have both. The P-51 Mustang broke this triangle through a combination of design excellence, technological innovation, and the kind of practical problem-solving that characterized American engineering at its best. The aircraft's origins trace to a 1940 British request to North American aviation for additional production of the Curtiss P-40 fighter. North American's engineers, led by lead designer Edgar Schmood, responded with a counter-proposal. They would design an entirely new fighter superior to the P-40 and deliver the prototype in just 120 days. The British, desperate for aircraft as the Battle of Britain raged, accepted. The design that emerged emphasized aerodynamic efficiency above all else. Schmood's team used laminar flow airfoils, wing profiles designed to minimize drag by maintaining smooth airflow over the wing surface, and crafted the fuselage with obsessive attention to reducing every source of aerodynamic resistance. They mounted the radiator for the liquid-cooled engine beneath the fuselage in a duct designed to use the cooling airflow to generate forward thrust, effectively making the cooling system contribute to propulsion rather than simply creating drag. Every rivet was flush-mounted, every surface was smoothed, every design decision evaluated for its impact on reducing drag. The result was an airframe that slipped through the air with exceptional efficiency, but the early Mustangs, powered by Allison engines optimized for low-altitude performance, proved disappointing at the high altitudes where bomber escort operations occurred. The aircraft could fly fast and far at 15,000 feet, but at 25,000 feet, it was sluggish and underpowered. The British, who had ordered the aircraft and put it into service with the RAF, recognized that the Mustang's exceptional airframe was married to the wrong engine. The solution came from Britain in the form of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the supercharged V-12 engine that powered Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Merlin, with its two-stage supercharger, maintained power output at high altitudes where the Allison faltered. In October 1942, a Mustang was experimentally fitted with a Merlin engine, and the result transformed aviation history. The Merlin-powered Mustang possessed speed exceeding 440 miles per hour at altitude, climb rates that matched or exceeded German fighters, and handling characteristics that pilots praised universally. Most importantly, The marriage of the efficient Mustang airframe with the powerful Merlin engine created a fighter that could carry substantial fuel loads with minimal performance degradation. But even the Merlin Mustang lacked the range for deep escort missions until engineers solved the external fuel tank problem. Drop tanks, auxiliary fuel tanks carried externally and jettisoned when empty, had existed since the 1930s, but they were heavy, created significant drag, and often suffered reliability problems with fuel transfer systems. North American engineers developed new drop tank designs optimized for the Mustang, using lightweight pressed paper construction for smaller tanks and formed aluminum for larger ones. These tanks attached to pylons beneath the wings, and when full, they barely degraded the Mustang's performance. The fuel system allowed pilots to draw from external tanks first, burning off that fuel before engaging in combat, then dropping the empty tanks to restore full combat performance. The mathematics of the system bordered on miraculous. The Mustang's internal fuel capacity of about 265 gallons could sustain roughly 450 miles of combat radius. Adding two 75-gallon drop tanks extended that radius to approximately 650 miles. Adding two 108-gallon drop tanks pushed the radius to over 750 miles, enough to escort bombers from England to Berlin and return with fuel to spare for combat. No other fighter in operational service anywhere in the world could approach this combination of range and performance. The first P-51B Mustangs, equipped with Merlin engines, began reaching 8th Air Force units in England in November 1943. Initial deployments occurred cautiously, with the new fighters assigned to escort shorter-range missions while pilots and ground crews familiarized themselves with the aircraft. The Mustang groups flew their first escort mission to Kiel, Germany on December 13, 1943, and returned without loss, the fighters having demonstrated both the range and performance that doctrine promised. Through January and February 1944, more Mustang groups arrived in England, and mission assignments penetrated progressively deeper into German airspace. The German fighter pilots who first encountered Mustangs over Germany in early 1944 initially dismissed them as a marginal improvement over existing American fighters. The Thunderbolts and Lightnings they had been fighting possessed certain performance advantages. The Thunderbolt was rugged and fast in a dive. The Lightning had twin-engine reliability and heavy armament, but both had limited range that created predictable engagement zones where German fighters could attack bombers without interference. The Mustangs seemed like more of the same, capable aircraft operating at the edge of their endurance, soon to turn back and leave the bombers vulnerable. This assumption died hard and bloodily through February and March 1944. The Mustangs did not turn back. They remained with the bomber formations through the entire mission, from English coast to target to English coast again. More critically, once the external tanks were dropped and German fighters attempted to engage the bombers, the Mustangs proved devastatingly effective in air-to-air combat. The aircraft combined speed, maneuverability, and rate of climb in a package that could match or exceed anything the Luftwaffe flew. In the hands of properly trained pilots, the Mustang could outturn the Focke-Wulf 190, outclimb the Messerschmitt 109, and outrun both in level flight at altitude. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace with over 100 kills, later described encountering Mustangs over central Germany in March 1944. "We saw them circling high above the bomber formation, positioned perfectly for diving attacks. When we committed to engage the bombers, they fell on us like hawks. The acceleration in a dive was exceptional, and they could follow us through any maneuver. Most disturbing was the knowledge that these fighters had fuel to pursue us anywhere we tried to disengage. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy who held every advantage, altitude, speed, numbers, and endurance, cannot be overstated." The mission over Berlin on March 6, 1944, the opening scene of this narrative, marked a psychological and strategic turning point. For the first time, American escort fighters accompanied heavy bombers all the way to the German capital and back. The Luftwaffe threw over 500 fighters against the bomber stream that day, and in the air battles that raged across central Germany, the Americans lost 69 bombers but claimed over 80 German fighters destroyed. The exchange ratio still favored the defenders slightly, but the trend was clear and irreversible. American fighters could now contest air superiority anywhere over Germany, and the attrition of experienced German pilots was accelerating to unsustainable levels. The symbolic object that represents the Mustang's revolutionary impact is the drop tank itself, those sleek external fuel containers that hung beneath the wings, that transformed an exceptional fighter into a strategic weapon capable of escorting bombers across an entire continent. The drop tanks were not glamorous. They were cylindrical metal or pressed paper containers, simple in construction, intended to be discarded after a single use. Yet these disposable objects embodied the American approach to solving the escort fighter problem. Rather than accepting the physics limitations that trapped other air forces, American engineers created a system that temporarily carried additional fuel, extracted every possible mile from it through aerodynamic efficiency, then shed the weight when combat required maximum performance. German pilots learned to recognize Mustang groups by the drop tanks visible beneath their wings, and they learned to fear the moment when those tanks fell away. The drop tanks, tumbling earthward like silver cylinders, signaled that the American fighters had transitioned from escort mode to combat mode, that they possessed full fuel reserves in internal tanks and full combat capability. Luftwaffe tactical reports from spring 1944 begin to include references to avoiding engagement with enemy single-engine fighters carrying external tanks, and recommendations to attack bomber formations only when escort fighters have expended external fuel reserves, advice that acknowledged the Mustang had fundamentally changed the tactical equation. The winter and spring of 1944 saw the application of Mustang-escorted bomber raids as part of a coordinated campaign that aimed to destroy the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force before the planned invasion of Normandy. The strategy, advocated by General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, shifted emphasis from protecting bombers to actively hunting German fighters. Mustang pilots received new orders. Once bombers were safely away from target areas, the escorts were free to descend to low altitude and strafe German airfields, attacking aircraft on the ground, destroying infrastructure, and forcing the Luftwaffe to disperse its forces and divert resources to airfield defense. This shift from defensive to offensive escort tactics multiplied the Mustang's impact. German fighter pilots found themselves hunted not just in the air but on the ground, pursued to their own airfields, attacked during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. The psychological pressure proved immense. Luftwaffe pilot training programs, already degraded by fuel shortages and the loss of experienced instructors, accelerated attrition as new pilots entered combat with inadequate preparation and were quickly shot down. The veterans who remained faced mounting exhaustion from flying multiple sorties per day against overwhelming odds. The statistics document the transformation with brutal clarity. In January 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 161 heavy bombers to enemy action, while claiming 204 German fighters destroyed. By May 1944, bomber losses had dropped to 130, despite a massive increase in sortie rates, while German fighter losses exceeded 450. The exchange ratio had inverted. The Luftwaffe was being ground down through attrition it could not sustain, losing pilots faster than training programs could replace them, losing aircraft faster than factories could produce them, bleeding to death in a war of attrition against an enemy with effectively unlimited resources. The transformation in German tactical doctrine through this period reveals the growing desperation. Early 1944 Luftwaffe fighter tactics emphasized aggressive engagement of bomber formations using massed attacks intended to overwhelm defensive fire through concentration of force. By late spring, tactics had shifted to hit-and-run attacks, attempting to disrupt bomber formations and score quick kills before Mustang escorts could react. By summer, many German fighter units avoided combat with escorted formations entirely when possible, preserving their strength for attacks on unescorted or lightly defended targets. The Luftwaffe had transitioned from an offensive force contesting air superiority to a defensive force practicing survival. German technological responses to the Mustang threat revealed both the quality of German engineering and the inadequacy of technology alone to overcome strategic disadvantages. The Luftwaffe introduced improved versions of existing fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109G10 and K4 with enhanced engines, the Focke-Wulf 190D with liquid-cooled engines optimized for high-altitude performance. These aircraft matched or slightly exceeded the Mustang in specific performance parameters, but they arrived in small numbers, flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots, and supported by a logistics network strangling under fuel shortages and Allied bombing. More dramatically, Germany accelerated development of jet-powered fighters, particularly the Messerschmitt Me 262, which entered operational service in summer 1944. The Me 262 possessed speed exceeding 500 miles per hour, far beyond anything piston-engine aircraft could match, and it carried heavy armament designed to destroy bombers with short bursts. Yet even this technological marvel could not restore German air superiority. The jets consumed fuel voraciously, limiting endurance to under an hour. They required long takeoff and landing runs that made them vulnerable to strafing attacks. Most critically, they entered service too late and in too small numbers to affect the strategic balance. The Luftwaffe could produce wonder weapons, but it could not produce enough of them quickly enough to matter. The Mustang, by contrast, entered mass production with American industrial efficiency that bordered on overwhelming. North American Aviation's production lines in California churned out Mustangs at rates exceeding 400 per month by mid-1944. Additional production came from a factory in Texas, and eventually over 15,000 P-51s were manufactured, more than any other American fighter except the P-47 Thunderbolt. The aircraft required approximately 10,000 man-hours to build, half the time needed for a B-17 bomber. The supply of replacement aircraft meant that American fighter groups could sustain combat operations despite losses, could replace attrition, could expand their forces while German units contracted through irreplaceable losses. The pilots flying these Mustangs represented another American advantage that technology alone could not provide. The Army Air Forces had established extensive training programs that produced pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time before they entered combat, including significant time in the specific aircraft types they would fly operationally. These pilots received gunnery training, formation flying practice, and tactical instruction that prepared them reasonably well for combat conditions. When they arrived at operational squadrons, they joined units with experienced pilots who could mentor them through their first missions. German pilot training, by contrast, had collapsed under the pressures of fuel shortages and pilot attrition. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilots entered combat with as little as 150 hours of total flight time, much of it in training aircraft rather than operational fighters. They lacked fuel for extensive practice, lacked experienced instructors who had been pulled back to combat units, and lacked the gradual introduction to combat that might have preserved their lives long enough to develop competence. The result was predictable. Inexperienced German pilots flying inferior numbers of aircraft achieved increasingly poor results against American pilots who had every material and training advantage. The battle for air superiority over Europe effectively ended in spring 1944. though fighting continued through the war's conclusion. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe could muster only 319 sorties against the invasion fleet and beaches, while Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties in support of the landing. German air power had been reduced to near irrelevance through the attrition campaign that the Mustang had made possible. The bombers that the Mustangs had escorted destroyed German industry, transportation networks, and fuel production facilities, creating cascading failures that ensured air superiority could never be regained. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots who survived into the war's final months reveals itself in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews. These men had entered service in an air force that had dominated European skies, that had destroyed enemy air forces and supported army operations with devastating effectiveness. They had been the elite, the knights of the modern age, celebrated in propaganda and genuinely respected by their countrymen. By 1945, they were flying obsolescent aircraft with inadequate fuel against overwhelming numbers of enemies who possessed every advantage. The transformation from hunter to hunted, from elite to victim, from confidence to fatalism, marked their experience indelibly. Lieutenant Hans Hartmann shot down 3 times in the war's final year and, surviving each time, wrote in his diary in March 1945, "The American Mustangs are everywhere. We see them at altitude escorting their bombers. We see them on the deck strafing our airfields. We see them in our nightmares. The pilots are not supermen. We shoot them down when we have advantages. But they are competent, and there are always more of them. For every one we destroy, 2 more appear. We cannot win through. We can only survive or die." The technical specifications that made the Mustang revolutionary can be quantified precisely. Maximum speed, 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Rate of climb, 3,400 feet per minute. Service ceiling, 41,900 feet. Combat radius with drop tanks, 750 miles. Armament, 650 caliber machine guns with 1,800 rounds total ammunition. These numbers describe capability, but they cannot capture the psychological weight those capabilities created when deployed by an air force with unlimited industrial backing and replacement capacity. German fighter pilots calculated these numbers in their heads during every mission. They knew that engaging American bombers meant facing Mustang escorts with full fuel reserves and altitude advantage. They knew that attempting to disengage meant being pursued by fighters that could follow them anywhere. They knew that returning to their airfields meant potential strafing attacks during landing approach when their aircraft were most vulnerable. They knew with increasing certainty as the war progressed that the mathematics of survival had turned against them. The drop tank, that simple cylindrical fuel container, became the symbol of this inverted equation. In the early years of the war, German pilots had calculated fuel reserves to determine when Allied escorts would turn back, creating windows of opportunity for attacking undefended bombers. The drop tank eliminated those windows. The falling tanks, visible from miles away as they tumbled from Mustang wings, announced that American fighters had transitioned from escort mode to full combat capability while still deep over German territory. The psychological impact of seeing those tanks fall matched the tactical impact. German pilots understood that they now faced enemies who held every advantage and accepted none of the limitations that physics had previously imposed on fighter operations. The final months of the war saw the Mustang applied to roles far beyond strategic escort. Mustang groups flew ground attack missions, destroying trains, vehicles, and infrastructure across Germany. They provided close air support for advancing Allied armies. They flew interdiction missions, cutting supply lines and isolating German forces. The aircraft that had been designed to escort bombers had evolved into a multi-role fighter capable of dominating any mission profile at which it was employed. This versatility reflected the fundamental soundness of the original design, an efficient airframe married to a powerful engine controlled by a pilot trained to exploit every advantage. German industry, by contrast, had fragmented its fighter development across multiple competing designs, each optimized for specific roles, none achieving the all-around excellence that made the Mustang so valuable. The Germans fielded heavy fighters, light fighters, interceptors, and ground attack variants, each with its own logistics, training, and maintenance requirements. This specialization made sense when Germany possessed air superiority and could deploy the right aircraft for each mission. It became a catastrophic disadvantage when losing the attrition war meant that no single design could be produced in sufficient numbers to matter. The symbolic power of the drop tank extended beyond its tactical function to represent American industrial philosophy writ small. The tank was designed to be disposable, manufactured cheaply, used once, and discarded. This approach would have seemed wasteful to German engineers trained in traditions of craft and durability. But the disposable drop tank embodied American abundance, the willingness to manufacture millions of items for single use, because that approach solved problems more effectively than attempting to build reusable systems. The drop tanks cost perhaps $50 each to manufacture. Their contribution to winning air superiority over Europe was literally incalculable. Post-war analysis of the strategic bombing campaign confirmed that the destruction of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force represented the single most important achievement of the Allied air war in Europe. The bombing of German industry and infrastructure caused significant damage, but German production actually increased through 1944 despite the bombing. What could not be replaced were the pilots, the fuel, and the tactical flexibility that air superiority provided. Once the Luftwaffe lost control of German skies, Allied armies could advance with air support that made German tactical doctrine obsolete. Allied bombers could strike targets with increasing impunity, and German industry had to divert enormous resources to air defense that might otherwise have supported ground forces. The Mustang made this victory possible not because it was revolutionary in any single characteristic, but because it combined range, performance, and availability in proportions that broke the strategic stalemate. The bomber offensive had been failing in late 1943 because unescorted bombers could not survive against determined fighter opposition. The Mustang provided escort capability that rendered German fighter tactics obsolete, forced the Luftwaffe into an attrition battle it could not win, and created the conditions for air superiority that shaped every subsequent operation in the European theater. The epilogue to the Mustang story unfolds across decades of consequence. The pilots who flew these aircraft in combat returned home as veterans of a successful campaign, their experience having validated the strategic bombing doctrine that had guided American air power planning. Many remained in military aviation, forming the core of the post-war Air Force and carrying forward lessons learned in the skies over Germany. The aircraft itself remained in service for years, seeing combat in Korea and with foreign air forces through the 1950s and beyond. But the immediate significance, the historical pivot point, occurred in those months from late 1943 through mid-1944, when the Mustang transformed the strategic bombing campaign from potential failure into decisive success. The Germans never fully understood what had defeated them, until after the war, when captured Luftwaffe commanders analyzed the campaign and acknowledged that American fighters with unprecedented range had made German air defense untenable. The expectation had been that physics and fuel limitations would constrain Allied escort fighters sufficiently to create defensive opportunities. The drop tanks and efficient airframe design that gave the Mustang its range had broken those constraints and, broken with them, the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy. The drop tank sits in a museum now, mounted beside a restored P-51D in Air Force markings. The tank is aluminum, cylindrical, with mounting brackets visible at the top and a fuel cap protruding from the upper surface. It weighs perhaps 20 pounds empty and would have held 75 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline when full. The label identifies it as a standard external fuel tank used by 8th Air Force Mustang fighters during escort missions over Germany. What the label cannot convey is the weight this object carried in the calculations of pilots on both sides, the hope it represented to bomber crews who saw it beneath escorting fighters' wings, the fear it induced in German pilots who understood its implications. This simple fuel tank, manufactured by the tens of thousands and discarded after single use across the fields of England and Germany, represented more than extended range. It represented the American approach to warfare, solving problems through industrial abundance, accepting inefficiency in individual components to achieve efficiency in overall systems, designing for disposability when that served strategic purposes. The Germans had engineered beautiful, complex, carefully crafted fighters that could not be produced in adequate numbers. The Americans had engineered a good fighter, added disposable fuel tanks, and manufactured the entire system in overwhelming quantities. The mathematics were inexorable. A Mustang with drop tanks could escort bombers to Berlin and engage German fighters in combat over their own airfields. A German fighter operating from that airfield could match the Mustang's performance, but could never match its numbers, its replacement rate, or the training level of its pilots. The attrition battle that resulted had only one possible outcome, determined by industrial capacity and resource availability long before the first shots were fired. The contrails above Berlin in March 1944 traced the death of German air power, though the fighting would continue for another year. The Mustangs circling in those contrails carried drop tanks that had already completed their mission, extending range to bring American fighters deep into Germany, and would soon fall away as combat began. Each falling tank represented a small victory in the campaign for air superiority, a disposable component that had served its purpose and was now discarded. The Germans watching from below, or fighting in the air, or analyzing reports in headquarters, gradually comprehended that they faced an enemy who could afford to manufacture and discard millions of components while they struggled to maintain hundreds of aircraft with inadequate fuel and spare parts. This was the strategic reality that the P-51 Mustang enforced through its unprecedented combination of range and performance. The aircraft itself was excellent, but excellence alone could not have won air superiority. It was excellence multiplied by abundance, performance multiplied by numbers, capability multiplied by the industrial base that could produce 15,000 airframes and millions of drop tanks and billions of rounds of ammunition. The Germans could match individual capability. Their late war fighters equaled or exceeded the Mustang in some performance metrics, but they could never match the system, the aircraft, the tanks, the fuel, the ammunition, the pilots, the training, the replacement capacity, all functioning together as an integrated whole that overwhelmed through sheer material superiority. The drop tank, falling through the air above Berlin that March morning, carried with it the symbolic weight of this entire system. It was a simple object, soon to be empty and worthless, manufactured to be used once and forgotten. But in its simplicity lay the revolutionary insight that won air superiority over Europe. That disposable abundance properly applied defeats crafted scarcity every time. The Germans had built an air force based on quality, training, and tactical excellence. The Americans had built an air force based on quantity, industrial capacity, and strategic persistence. When these philosophies clashed in the skies over Germany in 1944, the outcome was never in doubt. The Mustang taught this lesson with elegant finality. Its range ended German air superiority not through any single quality, but through the combination of good design, mass production, and strategic application that characterized American military power at its most effective. The aircraft that escorted bombers to Berlin carried beneath their wings the material embodiment of democratic industrial capitalism fully mobilized for total war. Those drop tanks, so simple and disposable, represented the principle that free societies can organize, produce, and deploy resources on scales that totalitarian systems cannot match. The Germans never knew that drop tanks would end their air superiority forever. They simply knew that American fighters appeared everywhere, that combat had become unsustainable, that the mathematics of survival had turned against them. The tanks fell away above German cities, and with them fell any remaining hope that the Luftwaffe could contest control of its own skies.